Well, you weren't supposed to be getting a video today, but Blizzard has announced they are going to be pushing, next reset, a new set of hotfixes, buffing underperforming specs. Now, a lot of these names are going to be familiar because it is not the first time they have gotten buffed since the release of this expansion. So we're going to go over all of the specs as well as just take a look how much have they been buffed since November, basically in 3 months. Especially considering the balance they had before, because some of these specs are going to be looking weird when we inspect what has been going on in the balancing, and we see that certain specs have gotten severely nerfed before the release of the expansion, and now they are on their third or even fourth set of buffs, while still being very underperforming. So you have already seen this type of reasoning that I mentioned in my last 2 videos regarding covenants, several covenants being severely nerfed before the expansion and now they are essentially unplayed, and something similar has been happening to some of the specs. So let's go over all of the current buffs that Blizzard is intending to push through for the next reset. The first spec in line is Frost. Now, since the release of this expansion, Frost hasn't really gotten any changes besides the 2% more damage adjustment when you're using a two-hander, which was more so a balancing to make it compete with the dual wield build of Frost Death Knight and not just a buff in and of itself. So Frost Death Knight, despite being severely underrepresented compared to Unholy Death Knight, I'm sure you're all aware of this. This is pretty much the first time they are getting a proper, legit buff. Now, of course, it is worth remembering for all the other specs we will be going through that these are just hotfixes. Blizzard has repeatedly stated multiple times they are not going to address severe mechanic changes and core rotation changes in hotfixes. If you're looking for things like talent changes, passive changes, even some abilities and the mechanics and the way in which they work, it's not happening in a hotfix. The only thing you're going to be seeing in hotfixes is going to be damage increase, is going to be damage decrease, is going to be maybe cooldown reduction of some sort, but something very, very minor when it comes to affecting your playstyle, affecting your rotation. That is left for big patches. So the buff in question is a 5% all damage buff to all abilities. Now, unlike Unholy Death Knight, they don't do much of any pet damage, or they don't do very heavy auto attack damage, which means this 5% damage buff is going to increase and apply to most of Frost Death Knight damage. Obviously, if your abilities are buffed by 5%, but 50% of your damage comes from your pets, then that's not really a 5% damage buff, right? It's a 2.5% damage buff, because half of your damage isn't coming from your abilities. This is not really the case for Frost, so it is a solid buff. Now, when we look at the situation of Frost Death Knight, you should know by this point, after taking my lectures, that the struggle of a DPS spec, first and foremost, before even starting to compare with all the other DPS, before even starting to compare with the DPS of your same role, melee or ranged, you have to start competing with the DPS in your own class. It is obviously true for rogues, it is true for mages, for warlock, but also for classes with just 2 DPS specs, like warrior, and in this case, like Death Knight. Unholy, being as popular as it is, makes it so that there are going to be roughly 50 times less Frost DKs in raids compared to Unholy Death Knights. And when it comes to Mythic Plus, there are going to be roughly 15 to 20 times less Frost Death Knights than Unholy Death Knights. So obviously, this buff is going to be looking slightly worse in general, simply because not only Frost Death Knight has to get some bumps in its damage because it's underperforming even compared to other specs, but it is also underperforming compared to Unholy. So it is going to be difficult to see a particular rise of this spec. I'm sure you have noticed this in previous expansions as well. It's always difficult and rare to have 2 different specs of the same class being meta and very played at the same time. More often than not, one of them is going to make it out and become more popular. But of course, there should be levels in which the other spec is not that popular. When Arms is the more popular spec, Fury is very close behind. So that's a healthy type of less popular. When Elemental is more popular than Enhancement, Enhancement is not that far behind. So even though it's very likely that Frost is not going to take over or even get close to Annoy Death Knight, we should at the very least hope for them to become more represented than they currently are. Now, following up after Death Knight, we have Demon Hunter. Unlike Death Knight, Demon Hunter has received changes before, because Demon Hunter was part of the gang which received buffs in December. In December, Demon Hunter received a 5% damage increase to all of its abilities. And with this, now they're getting another 3% damage increase to all of its abilities. Now, this is a more interesting case, because we just went with Frost, which is the ugly brother of Unholy, much less played, but in case of Havoc, Havoc is alone on its class. This is a very clear example of contrast, because Havoc and Demon Hunter as a whole has been a very popular spec, very popular class since its inception, since its release, which means you have a large pool of players playing Havoc, and when Havoc isn't strong, that massive pool of players has nowhere to go. You don't have Frost Mage mains which can simply reroll to fire, and you don't have Destruction Warlock mains respecing to Affliction. A Havoc player has two options. Either they push through and they keep playing Havoc, or they opt to respec and reroll to Vengeance. Even more so this tier, when Vengeance is the most powerful tank spec, right? So it has definitely impacted the popularity of Havoc, we can see, because Havoc used to be in the top 5 of popularity pretty much all the time. Now, when you look at raids in terms of popularity, Havoc is only 9th, which is hilarious to say, because a spec that has performed as badly as Havoc has in raids wouldn't even be remotely close to being 9th in popularity. You know, a spec like Feral Druid has routinely outperformed Havoc in pretty much all of the fights, and yet there is like one Feral Druid for every 6 Havoc players. You can take a look in Mythic Plus as well. In Mythic Plus, although we can say that in Mythic Plus, Havoc's strengths are more outlined than in Raid, their strength in AoE and the utility they can bring in a Mythic Plus key is more relevant. Even then, they are still the 4th more represented melee spec behind Windwalker, Unholy, and Outlaw. So Havoc is pretty much the outlier in this example that has not been performing very well. It's the only spec that has not gotten very good results, but still remains very popular, because the class itself was very popular, almost exclusively thanks to Havoc. Vengeance has not been one of the more popular tank specs for a long time, pretty much since forever actually, while Havoc has consistently been the more popular melee DPS specs together with Rogue, which is pretty much the only reason why Havoc is still staying so represented. We will have to see what these buffs are doing. Of course, 3% seems small, but you know, it's gonna add up. The more of these type of buffs are gonna keep coming, so we will have to see how it goes for Havoc. Now, the next spec in line for a buff, it's Beast Mastery, together with the other Hunter specs, which have been informed right now of its existence, its survival. So Hunter has gotten its hands busy with the balancing regarding marksmanship over time. A lot of the end of the beta and start of Shadowlands had to do with balancing marksmanship, had to do with dealing with marksmanship balance. Survival and Beast Mastery sort of went under the radar, which is interesting considering how less performing they were compared to marksmanship. It is also even more interesting if we consider that in the pre-patch, just 10 days or so before Shadowlands launched, Beast Mastery was nerfed by 5% of its damage. So now, basically a little over 2 months later, we have a buff of 5% of its damage for the first time, together with Survival, which unsurprisingly was forgotten by Blizzard. They received pretty much no changes. Now, it's pretty telling when you look at the performance of raid encounters, where BM and Survival are right now. Literally the bottom 2. When it comes to representation, again, unsurprisingly, since pretty much forever, Survival is at the dead bottom, and then Beast Mastery isn't as much, for a somewhat similar reason to Havoc. Hunter is the more popular class in the game, pretty much, so even with the badness of Beast Mastery compared to marksmanship, there are so many Hunter players that Beast Mastery still manages to not be at the bottom, purely because of it. When it comes to Mythic Plus, is of course even worse. When it comes to representation, Beast Mastery and Survival together can't even string a 2% representation combined, so that's pretty sad. When it comes to Survival, I do think they need other things other than damage, similar to Assassination, similar to Frost Mage. It's not just needing more damage. When it comes to Beast Mastery though, I do think they're fine. When it comes to their rotation, when it comes to their mechanics, and more importantly, when it comes to their scaling, and what they're lacking is damage. But overall, I do think when we are looking at the worst of the worst, they are still not as bad. I don't think they have as many structural core issues as a Survival Hunter spec does right now. Now, getting past Hunter, we have to go to Frost Mage. Oh boy, Frost Mage has been a roller coaster, man. So, as mentioned, Frost Mage has just gotten a 9% damage increase buff to all of its abilities 2 weeks ago, literally. And now they're getting a new one. They are getting 3% more. So about Frost Mage. Again, let's rewind the clock. It's the beta. Everyone is playing Frost Mage. Frost Mage is the best spec in the beta. in Mythic Plus, in AoE, in cleave, in single target, they are doing tons of damage. So right before the expansion launches, in one of the last iterations of the beta, Frostmage gets a bunch of nerfs. One of their legendaries, Bleak Ice, gets nerfed. Their strongest conduit, related to their strongest ability, Ice Lance, gets massively nerfed. Then we have the pre-patch, which lists a whole bunch of nerfs for Frostmage, again centered around their strongest ability, Ice Lance, together with their strongest talent, Splitting Ice. And then right before the expansion launches, Frostmage gets another 4% damage nerf. Weeks go by, effectively more than a month goes by, and then Fire Mage is the only spec that's being played, and Frostmage is dead. So Blizzard launches a plan of rescue for Frostmage. They get buffed by 9%, and now they get buffed by 3%. So this was an interesting course of events. Frostmage had gotten clearly too heavily nerfed before the expansion, possibly Blizzard fearing the strength of Mage in the beta, so it made them go overboard with the changes. It is effectively something we will see similarly with Subtlety Rogue, which was pretty much in the same situation as Frostmage in the beta and has received pretty much the same treatment. A couple of bullets to their kneecaps. That's what happened to these specs. So now we will have to see exactly how Frost is doing. When it comes to popularity, of course, it's no surprise that Fire Mage is absolutely dominating. There is pretty much one Frost Mage per every 20 Fire Mages in raids, and there is just about one Frost Mage per every 10 Fire Mages in Mythic Plus. Now, unlike Frost and Unholy Death Knight, which are more similar in the type of damage they want to do, in the type of cooldown-based, both AoE and single target damage they want to do, which means if Unholy is better, then Frost is never going to get the chance to shine. Frost Mage has a pretty different type of damage profile than Fire. They are not at all centered around super strong cooldown like Combustion. They do have the ability for super powerful cleave, which Fire Mage doesn't have, and even very powerful sustained 3-4 target cleave, but also AoE, which also Fire Mage doesn't have. Fire Mage is just too centered around a single cooldown, so Frost Mage at the very least offers a difference in playstyle, which is something you always want to have a spec. You never want to be just the weaker version of another spec in your class, because it's gonna mean you never get played. So we will have to see how exactly these buffs are going to push Frost Mage up. Of course, this was the smaller one of the two. The 9% in mid-January was more poignant than just this 3%. But again, incremental buffs is how you see exactly when to stop, rather than giving a flat-out 20% more damage buff. Now, on to another buffed spec, again, is Assassination Rogue. Assassination, on the other hand, since we are coming from Frost Mage, is very, very different. Assassination turned off the lights and just went in stealth, very roleplay heavy throughout the whole beta. They basically went undetected. All the eyes were on Subtlety and its damage, partially even Outlaw, both specs which received several changes. I did complain myself in the beta where multiple beta changes were touching, and by touching I mean nerfing, Outlaw and Subtlety, but at the same time also for some reason nerfing Assassination. Assassination was getting caught in the crossfire. So in December, Assassination received a 5% damage buff. Then basically a month later, they received an 8% damage buff, and now they're getting a 5% damage buff. So we are sitting at an 18% damage increase from Assassination. This is where we start entering worrying territory, because when we go and look at the participation, Assassination is second last. Assassination has never been, please listen class, this is a very momentous occasion, Assassination has never been this scarcely represented in raid encounters since I bothered to go back and check, at the very least all the way down to Warlords of Draenor. What makes this even worse is that Subtlety and Outlaw, they're not particularly flavor of the month super strong in raid encounters. In Mythic Plus, yes of course, but Assassination was never the key spec for Mythic Plus keys. It was more of your good old reliable single target melee spec with tons of utility, with tons of defensives and ways to stay alive, which was one of the premier ways to get a spot in a raid comp as a melee. Have an immunity like a rogue. And even in raids though, Assassination is super low in representation. And now we're just going through 18% damage increase. So what's gonna happen in a month if Assassination is still at the very, very bottom? It's essentially saying that Blizzard launched a spec live on the expansion 20% weaker than it is now, and now it's still not enough to even be worth playing. It's pretty bad, you know, it doesn't look very good for the balance of the game. Now, I mentioned this multiple times, I don't think Assassination's problem is damage. They are an old, outdated spec. It has essentially not been changed in years. It is one of the specs that has received the least amount of changes. The rotation is still shockingly boring, and it leaves very little room for player expression, for skill expression. The skill ceiling of an Assassination Rogue is a basement floor, and Blizzard hasn't really innovated the spec in a while, so I don't even think a 10 or 15% buff is going to do much of anything. At this point, you will have to wait for 9.1 and hope that any more poignant core mechanic changes are going to come for Assassination. That's just how it is. Now on to another spec, which has gone through quite a trip to get here, which is Enhancement Shaman. As you know, of course, Blizzard initially planned to rework Elemental and Enhancement around a new mechanic, a new old mechanic called Fulmination. Then they gave up and went back to Maelstrom and Maelstrom Weapon. So before the release, in the beta, right before the pre-patch, Enhancement was nerfed. Enhancement got a 30% damage nerf to the Wind Fury damage, as well as a heavy nerf to their strongest legendary, Doomwinds, which is currently still the strongest legendary, and yet it used to have 4 times more effectiveness than now. After this change, Blizzard adjusted Enhancement a little bit. In the beta, Enhancement was nothing special. It wasn't really OP or anything. Blizzard gave them a shower of buffs, from talent changes to flat-out damage changes. They nerfed the damage of Wind Fury, but then they buffed the proc damage of Wind Fury by 240%. They finally made Feral Spirits a viable and strong cooldown by increasing the scaling of their pet damage by 270%, and then a series of other talents, all being flat-out buffs by even 20, 30, 70%. Now, these all look like very big numbers, right? Which kind of goes to show you the situation, because even on release, right after this buff, which was in the pre-patch in November, it did nothing. You know, Enhancement wasn't particularly strong, it still isn't particularly strong, and it still suffers from one of the key problems of melee specs, which is not having anything to bring to the raid. Havoc gets away with it because they have a debuff to bring. Unholy doesn't need to get away, but if it was weak, they could get away because they have something still useful like Anti-Magic Zone. Warriors get away because they have Battle Shout and Rallying Cry. Enhancement Shaman's only question mark was, what if Wind Fury becomes a mainstay for your raid? What if everyone now requires a Wind Fury totem? Turns out you don't. Turns out Wind Fury doesn't do as much as expected. The only, unluckily for Enhancement, Wind Fury weapon is only a massive damage boost for a spec like Arms Warrior. It can go well over 5% damage increase for an Arms Warrior, which is amazing. Unfortunately, not many Arms Warrior are playing right now. Arms Warrior is not exactly one of the more and better performing specs to begin with, so Enhancement would have gotten more luck if they were buffing the damage of Balanced Druids and Marksmanship Hunters, you can say. So after the massive buff in the pre-patch, they were left alone for months, up until now, where they have just been given a 3% damage increase. Now, Enhancement in raids hasn't performed as badly as Survival, as Beast Mastery, even Arms and Assassination and Havoc. Also, very much unlike Assassination, their rotation, their core mechanics are, if anything, the complete opposite of Assassination. If anything, there is too much to do, too much to keep track of, and too much to synergize and play perfectly with Enhancement to play the spec to its highest. To the point where maybe the best solution for Enhancement would be to streamline the spec a little bit, maybe lose out a couple of extra GCDs, because right now the spec seems very full of GCDs to use, and losing some of them can make you lose a lot of DPS compared to other specs like Assassination, like Havoc, like Arms. So I think that would be a better change than just a flat damage buff. Still not very optimistic about the spec, as long as they don't have a key buff to bring to the raid. That's just how it is nowadays. Now, another spec that has gotten buffed was Destruction Warlock. One of the more interesting ones, because they have been towards the bottom of the damage and representation for a while now, even less than Demonology. It's particularly gratifying, to be honest, as a Mythic Raider in BFA, seeing the absolute disgusting situation of Destruction for months and months in BFA. You know, using 3 buttons, brain dead spec, and doing twice the DPS of other specs. Now they are in the gutter. So my inner Schadenfreude self is very happy about this. However, being a little bit objective, they are effectively the worst of the 3 Warlock specs. In raid, they have significantly less, of course, significantly less performance than Affliction Warlocks, but also quite a bit less than Demonology. In Mythic Plus, both Demo and Destro are just outclassed by Affliction and very less played. What is interesting though is that, similar to something like Beast Mastery, similar to something like Frost even, Destruction is still more popular than Demonology. If you go back to BFA and you see the popularity of Destruction because of how powerful it was, and the fact that Demonology has never quite been very popular, even now, where Demonology is factually outperforming Destruction, Destruction is still more popular. More players are willing to stick to the spec than to just reroll to Demonology. And even if they have to reroll, they are probably going to reroll Affliction or just stay Destruction. So the interesting part I was talking about is that in all of these months, Destruction has pretty much received one change. They have gotten a couple of legendaries buffed in the beta right before the pre-patch, but from the pre-patch to now, they have only gotten the December buff, which was the buff to their Chaos Bolt. Chaos Bolt was buffed by 22% more damage. This didn't really change anything. Destruction Warlock is still pretty weak. They do scale very hard with haste. They are very lopsided in their damage. A lot of their damage is in their finishers, and very little of their damage is in their spenders. So all they want is more haste to get more spenders out, so they can actually cast their finishers and do some damage. At the start of the expansion, this type of playstyle is pretty bad. It doesn't yield out much of any damage. They were equally bad at the start of BFA until they got bailed out by essences, by Azerite rates towards the mid to end of the expansion. So now they're getting a flat buff, 5%, but I don't think this is going to affect much of anything. I think they are in a similar situation of last expansion, somewhat similar to Havoc Demon Hunter, where they will need outside help from Blizzard. They will need borrowed powers to bail them out of the situation. Now, the last class on this list is going to be Warrior, who's getting buffs again. So, the roller coaster of Warrior. Warrior in the beta was uninspiring and bland. You know, they weren't doing too well. The tank, of course, wasn't doing too well at all, and Arms and Fury weren't spectacular in anything. We all know the ever-living meme that Warriors scale very well with gear. They have massive benefits coming from haste, coming from faster GCDs and getting to press more buttons, unlike other specs. At the start of the expansion, it was somewhat expected for them to not be performing well at all. Also, in Mythic class, when it comes to AoE, when it comes to this type of playstyle, they were never that popular to begin with. They've always been a very specific execute type single target spec for many expansions, for many tiers of raids. Now, the interesting part is that in the pre-patch, they got buffed. Arms damage was buffed by 6%, and Fury damage was buffed by 10%, and then Arms also got the buff of having Cleave no longer replace Sweeping Strikes, which is very good for Mythic class. Then we go to December. December, you have Warrior getting Mortar Strike buffed by 20%. You have Fury getting 5% more damage. You go into January, and Fury gets all of his abilities increased by 8% in damage, except for Bladestorm and Dragon Roar. And now you have the final round of buffs, which is another 3%. Now this sort of puts into perspective the meaning of Warriors scaling. Even when you buff them by flat damage, they still don't have the haste to perform. They still don't press enough abilities fast enough to do good damage. The representation, of course, is very similar to Havoc, in the sense that Warrior is also one of the more popular classes in the game, which means even when Warrior is not doing too well, many people are still gonna play it. Even more so DPS this tier, because Protection Warrior, unlike BFA, unlike the last part of BFA, is garbage. So everyone who was even thinking about playing Protection either fled to a different tank or is now playing a DPS Warrior. Lastly, just like Havoc, they have something to bring to the raid, for which you want a Warrior anyways, Battle Shout and Rallying Cry. So the representation of both specs is actually very good compared to their current power. You know, Arms Warrior is 7th, it is the second most represented melee spec behind Unholy, and Fury is middle of the pack. I mean, Fury is beating Enhancement and Feral, which are standalone specs in their own class for melee, and Fury is still ahead of them. You know, that's how good and how well represented Warrior is, considering its current situation. For Mythic class, they're also doing fine compared to the rest. You know, compared to the rest of these hobo, underperforming, underplayed specs, they are nowhere near things like Feral, Enhancement, Frost, Subtlety, Assassination, and Survival. They are comfortably sitting in the middle of the pack. So as far as Warriors go, I will stand by my meme and say that, don't worry, they scale. They will continue scaling, and then 1 year from now, I will come back here and tell all of you that you were whiny bitches because now Warrior is OP, doing too much damage, and the fault is because of all of the buffs that they are receiving now. Of course, I don't think it's the nice way to balance a class. Make them unusable for the first year of the expansion and then make them too strong for the last year of the expansion. That's something that Blizzard has to fix. Now, when all is said and done, we look at the specs that have gotten buffed. In Mythic Plus, the melee DPS specs that were buffed are here. Pretty much every single one of the least represented specs have gotten buffs, except for Feral. Feral Druid has been left out. And also, to be fair, Feral Druid's problem, so to speak, in Mythic Plus is the type of damage they can do in AoE, their burst damage they can do in AoE, more so than just buffing their damage. They would need some, core mechanics changes to give them that type of AoE burst damage. And then, of course, the exception of specs like Havoc and Arms being from very popular classes, meaning they will stay rather high in representation. And for range DPS, these are the specs that have received buffs. Again, I don't think it's going to change too much for Beast Mastery and for Destruction. I do think Frost has, the more chances, the more options at becoming better, or at the very least good. When it comes to raids, these are the specs that were buffed. Of course, the outliers being Arms and Havoc, coming from two very popular classes, remain very popular, and then pretty much all of the bottom, with the exception of Feral Druid, again, and then the two left out, which are surprising, are Arcane Mage and Demonology Warlock. To be fair, Demonology and Arcane, at the very least when it comes to raids, are performing better than Destruction and Frost Mage, despite the more popularity of those specs. So maybe Blizzard took them into account, or maybe Blizzard is planning more changes for these specs. So, now we are done looking at all of these buffs. I do think this is the right way to buff the specs, going bit by bit, 5% by 5%, and look at any meaningful changes in their performance, and if nothing happens, buff them by 5% more. Of course, it does become kind of slow and kind of frustrating when you see specs that have, by now, got them buffed by almost 20%, and they're still underperforming, or specs that were nerfed before the expansion release, and now they start getting buffed 2 months after the release of the expansion. You do kind of ask yourself, couldn't you just not nerf us before the expansion? Or could you just buff us 2 months ago? But, by this point, Season 1 is well on its way. Many of these more impactful changes are going to happen for the next tier, for the next season, for 9.1 and onwards. So we're basically done the refining period of the first couple of weeks of the raiding and Mythic Plus season, and we are now entering the refitting and retooling season before the next big patch. Now, I can't wait to see all of the civil comments of people screeching in the comments for their favorite spec lacking buffs. I am particularly looking forward to Mistweaver Monks being forgotten, as well as Feral Druids. That's always a goodie. So I'm gonna leave instead. I'll take no part in this. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I guess see you at BlizzCon for more balance changes.